All right. Well, it is a minute after 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone to another edition of the National Association of Scholars webinar titled Right Ideas, where we examine thinkers who are either on the right or relevant to the contemporary political right and intellectuals who consider themselves a part of the contemporary intellectual right. Now, today we're going to discuss a very significant figure in 20th century and early 21st century moral theory, Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre himself would not be considered a conservative. He has interesting critiques of conservatives and some harsh words for them in his many very highly acclaimed works. But nonetheless, MacIntyre offers a critique of modern moral theory and a critique really of modern politics that has been used by figures and thinkers on the right now for several decades, which makes him a really interesting figure to grapple with. And that's the hope of today's webinar. So joining us today are two distinguished guests. One is Dr. RJ Snell, who is the editor-in-chief of Public Discourse and the director of academic programs at the Witherspoon Institute, and Nathan Pinkoski, research fellow and director of academic programs at the Zephyr Institute. The way this webinar will work is first we will have some short presentations by both of our speakers, approximately 15 minutes. After that, we will open it up for questions from you, our audience, and of course, our panelists might have some questions for each other. I will certainly have questions for the panelists. We'll try to keep this conversational and really allow the ideas to drive our discussion for the following time that we have together. So as you are listening to both of our speakers, please feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat box. I'd be very appreciative to have those questions to give to our speakers. And so without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Pinkoski to start us off with his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. So what I want to do, partly to set up our conversation for the next hour and a half, and partly to remind ourselves as to what some of the positions of MacIntyre are, some of the views that are associated with him, is provide a very quick recap of what I think are some of the most important themes, and the ones that I think are most important for, let's think of it, of those of us who are interested in a conception of human flourishing. We call it a neo-Aristotelian conception of human flourishing, but I think what's pretty important to bear in mind here is a conception of human flourishing that's based on constructing thriving social roles rather than deconstructing social roles. And then additionally, transmitting these from one generation to a next, handing it down within our social institutions, our social settings, whether it be a family, whether it be an educational community, whether it be a political community. And that is the way that I'd understand really what it means to be friendly to or sympathetic to the right, broadly understood, that insistence on transmission, the importance of transmission, and the insistence of constructing thriving social roles and passing them along rather than deconstructing them. So the remarks I have are set up with a sense of how MacIntyrean analysis can help us better understand what that project might involve or what it should not involve. Because as we must bear in mind, as was just noted for us, MacIntyre does not think of himself as a conservative. I think, though, using that kind of definition that I just did, we can see some of the similarities, though, and some of the insights that he offers towards those interested in transmitting a robust conception of human flourishing. All right, but before before I'll say a little bit more about that to conclude, but I want to just present what I think are some of the most important ideas MacIntyre has. And I think it's very important. Maybe some of you know his work through After Virtue and have a sense that, oh, MacIntyre, he's sort of the virtue guy, the one who's trying to revive the conception of virtue. And I think the basic framing we need to bear in mind when we're reading Alasdair MacIntyre, whether it's a famous book like After Virtue, whether it's some of his lesser well-known works, is MacIntyre mixes a critical argument and a constructive argument throughout his text. And sometimes these are weaved together, sometimes both are at work at the same time, and sometimes they're demarcated from each other. So it's useful for us to understand what his critical argument is, what's the target of his critique, in terms of the intellectual side of it, the sociological side of it, what he sees going wrong with society. And then we should have a view towards thinking about what his constructive proposals are. What does he propose as an alternative? So his critical argument, what's the target of his critical argument? Well, we may know this from other sources, from other places, from MacIntyre's reputation, but really his critical target is liberalism, or what I think is more specific is modern liberal individualism, since liberalism can be thrown around in all kinds of different ways. What MacIntyre is actually talking about is a unified intellectual political project that he thinks originated, really came into shape with the Enlightenment project. And so that's the modern part of modern liberal individualism. What about the liberal part? Well, what he sees here is he sees a way of conceiving moral theory that is about separating oneself from social roles. Don't define yourself vis-a-vis your social role that you have, whether as a carpenter, whether as a father, whether as a soldier, but look for a moral principle that is independent from that. So the archetypical liberal thinker par excellence is Immanuel Kant, because the principle that you're looking for to ground morality for Kant is autonomy, and this means, think of the Greek here, right? This means giving a law unto oneself, a law that is not influenced by your social position, that is not influenced by others around. So that's the liberal part of modern liberal individualism. And what MacIntyre sees happening in the kind of as the engine of modernity plays out is this conception, this idea, this Enlightenment idea comes to transform society in pernicious ways. And this is where I think we get the individualism part, the sort of the ism, the bad part of it. What happens is you have a transformation of the self here, and this is, I think, is an important part of After Virtue's argument that may not get a lot of attention beneath the flashier stuff, like why the Enlightenment project failed. These had to fail. These sort of exciting, provocative titles. But there really is if you're trying to focus on an idea that informs MacIntyre's critical argument, I think it is important to see the transformation in philosophical anthropology that he's drawing attention to. This, by the way, there's a great recent book that Carl Trueman wrote, where he draws from MacIntyre's insights to really make this clear for what happens in late modernity, that there is this conception of the self that emerges and has a radically different way of situating itself in the world. What MacIntyre draws attention to is how the transformation of the self entails a wholly different moral, ethical way of evaluating the world. It's not about rational standards anymore. It's not about one's commitment to rational standards. He says that whatever standpoint the self adopts is itself the justification for critique. And this is what he calls the theory of emotivism. That isn't a good moral theory in terms of describing how morality actually works, but it is a good theory for describing how societies come to reconceive of themselves, informed by this set of Enlightenment ideas. So whatever standpoint the self adopts, whatever point you take, as a self, that's good enough justification. The sort of language that we use nowadays, you do you, that kind of thing, I think is it just shows how pervasive this way of thinking has come. You can't criticize it, or it's very, at least very, very difficult to criticize a point of view that a person takes when one asserts that one's doing it because I'm declaring it, because I'm saying it. Very, very difficult to develop in a public setting the language that permits criticism of that standpoint, because that is the authority. So what we also have too in this concern about modern liberal individualism and where it goes, and this is something I want to put on the table for us, especially if we're thinking about projects to transform education, is we have a false political form, and indeed an illegitimate political form that emerges that's informed by this project. And that is, of course, the modern bureaucratic nation state. And MacIntyre, he has various ways of criticizing it, but I just wanted to mention two briefly. One is that this is informed by a false principle of justice, and that is the neutrality principle, a principle that cannot be true because we all, in fact, have commitments to what Rawls would call comprehensive doctrines, right? That we can't abandon. The neutrality principle is itself a kind of comprehensive doctrine, the sort of standard criticism, but quite a pertinent criticism of the liberal framework as advanced by a late modern thinker like John Rawls. But it's also a principle of justice that is easily exploited by those with power and money, easily taken advantage of, easily abused, because it's so abstract and you can kind of fill in the content however you like. That's MacIntyre's criticism of the Human Rights Project in many ways, is that it just gets filled in by whatever you want it to be. So that's one side of it. And the other side is that managerialism, this idea of legitimacy that's associated with a set of rulers, a set of experts, an expert class, a managerial class that claims to be able to understand the future, provide the policies that will yield the best outcomes for the future. This conception of organizing the world, this conception of organizing our political forms, is one, he thinks, which is an illegitimate conception. It's also false. It's a fraud, and we show it's a fraud because we can show that organizing societies based on law-like generalizations that presume to have the power to predict behavioral to predict the behavior of rational agents end up in extremely pernicious outcomes. I think we can think most recently of the policies enacted during the pandemic, where many people were simply assuming that if we just get everyone to do this, get everyone to follow this set of rules, then it's going to yield these particular outcomes. And of course, that was not the case, and we saw many pernicious consequences by the effort to try to pursue that, to make those policies happen, because it rested on, MacIntyre would say, a philosophical mistake about how rational agents, how human beings are. Now, what I think is also an important aspect to bear in mind for our understanding of MacIntyre is this, and this speaks a little bit to the problem that we face in the modern world of education. MacIntyre portrays the modern world as one of fragmentation, of breakdown, the end of moral discourse. I alluded earlier to the emotivist project, talking about the conception of the self that is attached to that. And you can think about what the implications of that are in society. If everyone has authority based on oneself and that self is not subject to rational criticism, then you're going to have just a proliferation of fragmentation, which means the end of any serious moral discourse, any serious discourse that has a goal of drawing people together, finding agreement, revising one's positions if they are mistaken. All that is going to fall out of play. And you get a bit of this, I think, in the late modern world, in the 21st century, with the celebration of diversity for its own sake, the celebration of fragmentation, of pluralism for its own sake. And I think it's important to bear in mind, MacIntyre is not against pluralism or against intellectual diversity, but we can't pretend that this is as good as agreement. We can't pretend that this can be the basis of a healthy society. We have to find some kind of agreement. We have to be able to pursue and have an inquiry and draw others into that if we're going to have any kind of rational conversation that's going to admit of moral progress, of social progress, of political progress. So this is, I think, an interesting aspect that can segue to what I think are some of the implications of MacIntyre's positions. These are things that I think he says explicitly, but also some things that are implicit in his argument that are worth bearing in mind. So one of the things I think that we can come into realizing, and this is, I think, especially pertinent for those of us involved in the world of education, is we fall into, or at least we see the temptation, or we fall into the temptation of thinking about this pluralism, about this this language of intellectual diversity as something to celebrate for its own strength. And we're very suspicious of, and when people say, beware the conservative ghetto or the Catholic ghetto or the Christian ghetto or whatever it might be, don't fall into those sorts of ways of thinking. We nod along and think, oh yes, of course, we must avoid that. Now I actually think that MacIntyre presents a challenge for us in that we might need to think about the benefits of having that kind of ghetto. Now, what I mean here is not a refusal to admit of rational criticism, refusal to engage with other positions that aren't one's own, but that we should go for depth rather than breadth. We should go for profundity rather than trying to secure a widest possible consensus, whether we're engaged at small local level practices or whether we're engaged in projects of educational reform, founding new schools, founding new universities. That breadth is, in a way, the wrong goal that we should have. We should go for a richer, deeper understanding of what our own positions are, and have the capacity to articulate those to ourselves, rather than an obsession about trying to secure the widest possible consensus or try to bring everyone into our project. And I was struck recently by this resignation letter that came out from Heather Hayne, who just resigned from the board of the University of Austin, this new educational project. And one of the things she notes in it, it's an interesting letter, I think, because you see someone who is a liberal, a political liberal, yearning for depth, yearning for profundity in education, and being concerned that this new educational project was going to be insufficiently deep. And she refers to some examples about the importance of devoting deep time, spending time with the students over meals, read out one of the lines there that she has, or spending times at camp. She says, breaking bread together, sitting around campfires together. And it was very interesting. I was struck by this because she really is, without thinking about it or perhaps even knowing about these kinds of institutions, she wants a reinvention of Wyoming Catholic College, institutions that are devoted to depth rather than securing the widest possible consensus, institutions which build hikes, campfires, spending time like that into their educational curriculum, or indeed the famous integrated humanities program, which was set up by John Senior at the University of Kansas, something which liberals shut down because they were concerned about it being too deep, perhaps too open to the most important, the most vital questions, that students were actually doing dangerous things like answering them and converting. You couldn't do that in education because it's about education's about trying to secure the widest possible consensus. Again, that neutrality paradigm, rather than going to explore with great profundity, with great curiosity, the most important questions and answering them. It's interesting to see someone working within a liberal paradigm being dissatisfied with a reform effort in education because it seems to lack that breadth. And so that's what I think is one of the most important constructive arguments for us to think about for MacIntyre. And I think it goes to, and I'll wrap up just by saying this, I think it goes to the plight that those who are on the right have, or those who are interested in this issue of transmission have in kind of the early 21st century. And this plight, I think, actually helps us because it gives a new, fresh importance to reading MacIntyre that wasn't necessarily there in the 80s and 90s. So what do I mean by this? Well, I think in the 80s and 90s, MacIntyre was certainly not a conservative and rejected conservatism because he saw late 20th century conservatism as set up to be a defense of whatever the order of the day was. You call it the moral majority, which is essentially to say whatever most people believe, that should be the way we govern ourselves. And that was a lot of the arguments for why we need popular sovereignty. The majority of Americans want this, ergo it must be true, ergo we should do this. Late 20th century conservatism had this desire to defend the particular order that was there at the time, and it was essentially its core principles that it kept referring to and articulating was set up to be the defender of whatever that order was. And that's why I think the curiosity of kind of what's happened in kind of the late 90s, early 2000s up into recent years, is that the luminaries of late 20th century conservatism, the ones who write the columns, the one who write the books, they were very good at defending what the order was. They were good at defending the most stable, persistent institutions of American politics, and defining conservatism in those terms, that you had to defend those institutions. That's why a lot of them, I think, being very ferocious defenders of American foreign policy, because the thing that is most persistent in American politics in kind of the late 20th century is not, say, a commitment to a particular set of constitutional norms or a way of understanding the Constitution, but the national security state, the Trumanite security apparatus, which has sort of been operated in the same way for decades without any consistent adjustments. And that's what conservatism became. So I think to a right that if you think of conservatism or you think of the right as just defending extant institutions, defending order, then MacIntyre will have little to say to you. And that's a position he does criticize, especially when he rewrites the preface to After Virtue, when he adds a new preface. He adds the conservative as a category, that a character type that we should criticize. But in the 21st century, if you think that most of the institutions governing us are in need of radical overhaul, if not complete abolition, if you think of that project that I began with, a way of defining the right as a project of transmitting human flourishing, and you see institutions as obstacles to that, most of the institutions as obstacle to us, if you think that the right is more or less in a position of insurgency, then MacIntyrean categories can become very, very useful for us to think about our predicament, and can also be useful for us as to think about what exactly we should be looking to build. So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting comments. And now we will continue with Dr. Snell.
Great, thank you, John. I appreciate the invitation to join you, and thank you, Nathan, for those remarks. MacIntyre is indeed an interesting figure, and indeed, my thanks to the National Association of Scholars for the invitation and for all the good work they've done for such a long time in the field of education in the academy. As has already been, forgive me, I'm a little under the weather, and so I'm haggard and hoarse. So forgive my voice and struggles here. As has already been mentioned, MacIntyre is not a natural fit for conservatives. He's a man of Manchester who most of his early concerns were about labor and unions and the workers. And indeed, what would often pass for American conservative thought would be something that MacIntyre might view indeed as something to overcome, or indeed as his nemesis. And in recent years, as conservatives seem to have appropriated MacIntyre for themselves, he seems to indicate a good deal of irritation about this, almost as if he wishes it weren't so, that the audience who has most resonated with him, or apparently has resonated with him, that he wishes he had a different audience in some ways. He even seems to go out of his way sometimes to sort of prick the balloon of his audience and to irritate them. The last 2 years, for instance, at the Notre Dame Fall Conference, it seemed clear to me that MacIntyre has sort of imagined a conservative audience and how he could annoy them with the claims that he's about to make. That being said, I think there's a lot that people on the right can learn from MacIntyre, and I'll make 3 suggestions today. Clearly not the only things that one could glean from MacIntyre, but 3 things that I think are worth thinking about. Here's the first, and this is admittedly a contestable claim. I'm a social conservative, so when I read MacIntyre, there are certain themes that emerge for me as most amenable to my own view, which not everyone on this webinar may share, and that's just ordinary disagreements on the right. And that's as follows. It seems clear to me that the libertarian streak that one can find in the right, and indeed the fusionism of conservative thought and libertarian thought that has been so prevalent in the American right since the Second World War, that the libertarian tendency is unable to sustain the very conditions which allows libertarianism to work. So if we think of whatever else libertarianism is, a sense that the government should be quite severely curtailed with its role, that only works if you have a flourishing society, if you have Burke's little platoons well and operating, if you have Tocqueville's spirit of religion well at work, so that you have an independent citizenry which is well ordered and well governed already, stable family, stable institutions, stable schools, and so on. And it seems to me quite apparent that once you have those institutions begin to dismantle themselves, that of course you're going to have a kind of statism emerge to fill in the blanks where ordinary civil society is no longer operational. And so libertarianism doesn't work when the conditions of social order start to fall apart. Now, and MacIntyre rejects that full and through. For MacIntyre, there's just no sympathy for ghostly and abstract visions of the human individual separated from society, not viewed already as a social and political animal. MacIntyre views us as thickly embedded in social roles, thickly embedded within institutions, and it's almost impossible for us to understand ourselves as persons, let alone to have a vision of the flourishing self without those social roles and without those thick commitments. Now, as everyone's aware, there's an ongoing and very long-standing debate about what the meaning of conservatism is. What does it mean to be a conservative? It could be to have a certain view of the government and its limits. It could be to have a certain role of the markets. Some people, of course, view conservatism as a kind of mood, that sort of Burkean or Russell Kirk sense that it's mainly a mood of gratitude and the rest of it is somewhat up for grabs. It could be even a kind of aesthetics or a commitment to order. It seems to me, or I'd posit for your reflection, that the basic conservative insight is an anthropological insight. It's a vision of what it means to be a human being. And it is summarized as following. Namely, that the vision of the human being as unencumbered or disencumbered, that what we are first and foremost are individuals who then contract into relationships, into commitments, that's fundamentally false. We are already and always have been born into encumbrances, most of which we haven't chosen, and which nonetheless bring with them real obligations and duties. Nathan and I didn't choose to be born Canadian. Lo and behold, we're Canadian, and that brings with it certain opportunities and limitations and obligations that we may wish to were otherwise. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose our genes. We don't choose the community or language or religion or lack of religion that we happen to be born into. Now, of course, those encumbrances are not so totalizing that we can't move away from them. They're not so all-encompassing that we can't, in the end, decide to remove ourselves from some of those obligations. We can take something of a cosmopolitan view and critique the communities of our origin and decide to move past them. But at the end of the day, we always begin as persons with both of our limits and our possibilities with those encumbrances. And MacIntyre knows that full well. In one of his books, Dependent Rational Animals, he wants to insist with the Aristotelian tradition that we are indeed rational animals, but he wants to also insist that we are the sort of rational animals who are encumbered with various dependencies. We have bodies with their limits. We have languages with their limits. And so we can't really understand our rationality, let alone operationalize that rationality without viewing our dependencies as first and foremost part of what it means to be rational. There's no way to exercise rationality without viewing ourselves not in the abstract as a bearer of rights or as an agent or as a moral being, but I'm someone's son, I'm someone's husband, I'm someone's parent, and I belong to this community with its duties and its social roles and so on. Now for MacIntyre, that becomes quite serious. MacIntyre wants to suggest that what allows for a flourishing community are those kinds of communities where you have networks in which there can be giving and receiving, right? We are not just entities who are self-enclosed. There's no sort of John Wayne story of the rugged individualist capable of doing things on their own. It's just bad anthropology. It's not true. Persons lack a real identity, and persons lack the ability for their personality to develop and to grow and to mature if they don't have roles given to them where they then learn their roles and their responsibilities within those encumbrances. So in After Virtue, for instance, MacIntyre makes some rather dismissive comments of the freedom, what he calls the freedom of ghosts, this vision of the Enlightenment individual where you can abstract away your race, your history, your religion. And so you start to remove everything about you which is particular. And in the end, what you're left with is a kind of stick figure of human being. And lo and behold, it's the same stick figure as every other human being who's ever been. And it's fundamentally free and rational. But of course, there's no real identity there, right? Once you remove RJ as a Snell and as the son of Gordon and Bonnie and the husband of Amy and the parent of Grace, and in this religious community and this language, there's nothing left. There's just a kind of ghost-like thin identity. And MacIntyre suggests that we become so devoid of self that it's as if the self that is constructed is like a coat hanger, and we can then pick and choose identities like a coat and place them on top of ourselves. But then sooner or later, we can also just remove those identities, find another coat, put it on top. But that, of course, is to not know who we are or what we're for, and to have such a thin vision of human flourishing as to be almost devoid of content. It's open, it's free, it's rational, but there's no content to it. You see that particularly, I think, in his discussion of rights, which are, take some people off guard, right? He says, like, rights are sort of like unicorns or witches. You can believe in them, they just don't really exist. Now, I myself am a natural lawyer. I believe in natural rights in a much more thick and robust way than I suspect MacIntyre does at points. But I take his rhetorical point to be true, which is there are rights only because there are first obligations. And there are rights only because there are first networks of giving and receiving and duties where I am responsible for the well-being of my children, and thus I have rights over their education in a way that the local school board just does not have. Or maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, but I have obligations to figure that out and to live in keeping with my intellect and the truth of the universe as I understand it, and therefore there are rights to religious freedom. But if there's just a devoid emptiness, rights become nothing more than a kind of wish fulfillment. And at the same time, then, his concern with virtue follows from that. If what it means for me to flourish is to flourish within networks of communities of giving and receiving, then what it means for me to live well is to develop the kinds of virtues which allows me to operate skillfully and with the proper dispositions within those networks of giving and receiving. So I need to be courageous, honest, just, not merely as a sort of master of my domain, right? Not just as a Kantian kind of agent in the universe with autonomy, but also as one who can receive from my community admitting my dependencies, admitting my vulnerability, my body, my age, the fact that I will soon become slower and more dependent on my children than I am now. And that is not necessarily a weakness or diminishment of human being, but is in fact part of the greatness of being human. Here's the second that I think follows from that. MacIntyre is so against these abstract notions of freedom and rights that what is sometimes referred to as the master argument in After Virtue, I think becomes quite central to understanding MacIntyre. And I think conservatives would be well served to take this argument seriously. Here's the master argument of After Virtue as I understand it. MacIntyre says that a fully formed ethical system would have three major components. I like to think of it as a sort of triangle. First, there is humans as we find ourselves to be. Then there is ethics. And then there is humans as we would be if we actualized our telos, or if we became what we were capable of becoming. Now, what MacIntyre means by that changes throughout his career, right? When he's more Marxist, when he's more Aristotelian, where he's more Thomistic, what he means by that triangular arc shifts. But MacIntyre suggests that the modern moral project tends to only have two of those 3 points. It has humans as we happen to be. It has ethics as a project, but what it tends to leave out or ignore is humans as we could be if we actualized our telos. Now, two things seem to follow almost immediately from that oversight or that lacuna of ignoring our telos or directionality. Here's the first. What in the world does it mean to develop an ethics based upon humans as we just happen to be right now? If you're an Augustinian, when you look at humans as we are right now, what you notice is concupiscence or disorder or disordered loves moving in all sorts of directions. At that point, ethics seems to be a remedial project. It seems to be just a kind of moral minimalism, or we get that version of duties which trains us to not do wrong. Like, here's your freedom moving in the way that human freedom moves as you are right now with your disorders and concupiscence and vices. And ethics becomes a minimalistic project to stop you from using your freedom incorrectly. But that's a truncated project because it doesn't actually have ethics move us into human flourishing, into our perfection, into our well-being. It just stops us from doing things as wrongly as we could. That's a moral minimalism. With that, of course, comes a sense that ethics is always against our freedom. Freedom is moving towards what we desire. But now ethics is viewed as something constraining or confining our will. And ethics can't help but be viewed as something we almost oppose by our nature because it's a limitation or even a damage to our freedom. And so rather than ethics being the full-fledged vision of human flourishing, ethics is a limit and almost an enemy to us. Or that's one possibility. We get a truncated ethics where ethics is viewed almost against us. Or second, if we have humans as we are, and then ethics without a relationship to what we could be if we flourished, you also get fantastical visions of ethics. You think of these wild projects of modernity where we can make things perfect. If we just had a little more money and a little more power given to our social engineer, the wild fantasies of ethics could make things just a little bit better if we gave the experts the managerial power that we needed. Neither of those are going to work. And I think MacIntyre rightly suggests that any ethics worth its salt has to take the full range of the human condition. Humans as we are, humans as we could be if we actualized our telos, and ethics as the relationship to move us through a slow, steady pedagogy in communities which make sense and are sober from the first condition to the latter condition. And here's the third, and I'll be very brief here. The third thing I think we can learn from this, and it's related to the first two, is the notion of MacIntyre of tradition-constituted rationality. MacIntyre does not believe in capital M morality. He does not believe in capital R reason. He tends to believe that what we have is the ethics of a sober community, or the reasons of a community which is operating over time, developing itself in keeping with its own understandings and premises. This is what Nathan referred to as going deep into a system as opposed to just the breadth of a system, actually understanding a community and its commitments as opposed to just believing everything. Now, MacIntyre in his early phase was sometimes viewed as almost a relativist. It was almost as if you had to pick a community, and it wasn't so clear in MacIntyre why you would choose one community over another. At the same time, I think there's something quite healthy for a conservative to remember that while someone like myself believes in the natural law and has a very high view of reason, I think conservatives are well served to be deeply suspicious of rationalism and the promises that rationalism can solve the world's problems merely with syllogism. I think conservatives are rightly suspicious of the 5-year plans to world success, prosperity, peacefulness, and the human condition finally having attained the eschaton. You know, Vogelin used to, I don't know if Vogelin ever said this actually, or if it's just things that people said Vogelin said, don't immanentize the eschaton. I think MacIntyre is well aware that the rationalistic dreams are really fever dreams. And there's a slow work of developing human identity, human capacity, and human relationship in sane communities, which takes a long time and even a narrative quest, as he puts it in After Virtue. There's lots there that conservatives can disagree about, but I think we're well served to take those kind of MacIntyrean concerns quite seriously. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Snell, and again to both of our presenters for what I thought were very stimulating presentations, and it makes me want to go back and read MacIntyre again. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give the audience members a few more minutes to think of questions, write questions in the chat box. We'll go to those in a moment, but I have a few questions of my own that I think might help us kind of tease out different aspects of MacIntyre's work. And so I wanted to start with a question about Dr. Snell, the embedded nature of humans, because you make the argument that's clearly within MacIntyre's work that humans are inevitably embedded in institutions. But at the same time, in Nathan's talk, we have a discussion of how institutions, at least the institutions of modernity, are oriented towards this kind of deconstruction of the individual. And it almost, and I think Nathan would say that these institutions are actually, in a way, removing our embeddedness. So how do you square the idea, or how would MacIntyre account for the fact that we are both embedded, but also the very institutions into which we're likely embedded in modernity are themselves sort of disembedding?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I mean, that I think presents one of the major educational and moral challenges of our time, which is that there's no tension between those claims. And here's what I mean. I think it's just true that human beings, by definition, are going to be institutional. I think we're social and political, and that it's impossible for it to be otherwise. Aristotle reminds us that we are neither gods nor beasts, and so we can't live and prosper outside of the city. So we're going to be formed by our institutions. That doesn't imply in any way whatsoever that the institutions which form our identities and our loves and our conceptions and our desires are going to be ordered, sane institutions, or even that those institutions will properly understand their roles. So, for instance, I think I would agree with what I took to be Nathan's claim, that there's a whole lot of contemporary institutions of learning, whether they're institutions of higher education like universities or secondary schools, which seem to have a kind of fragmentation as part of their own self-story. They're attempting to remove people from conceptions of family and religion and continuity with the past. Rusty Reno used to make this argument. I mean, I think Rusty still believes this, but there was a while a few years ago where Rusty was really after the idea of critical thinking. Like the liberal arts no longer knew what they were for. So the only thing that a dean of a school of liberal arts could promise was critical thinking, which meant to unmask and reveal as arbitrary everything your parents and grandparents had told you before you showed up at university. And what a horrendous approach that was to education, because it took the ordinary institutions of people's lives and viewed us to see them as arbitrary and to attempt to remove ourselves from them. That still is an institution forming us, but it's an institution forming us in a irrational fashion. I mean, I think this is why MacIntyre is suggesting that there's going to need to be alternative small communities being formed, which are going to take a long time. I mean, I think MacIntyre thinks we're in a multi-generational effort here to reconstitute sober communities of giving and receiving, where the human reality just remains institutions create our persons, or what Scruton would call non-natural persons help our natural persons come into being and flourish. That's going to happen one way or the other, for good or ill. We might as well have it be for good.
Nathan, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I think it could be useful to keep in mind one of the important conceptual distinctions that MacIntyre makes between practices and institutions. And his point here is not that, so the point, practices, pardon me, refer to activities that have a good internal to them. You can use chess examples, since he's influenced by Wittgenstein, and the importance of games it becomes important or insightful rather, to help us understand essential human activities. So when I learn to play chess, I'm hoping to play chess well, so I can understand how the game works, so I can have it with a view to mastering the rules. My playing chess might require an institution. It might require me to have a weekly chess club, or to join one or set one up at, say, a local library. Might involve something more competitive. To be able to play chess, I might, or to teach someone else to play chess, it might require an incentive external to the activity of chess to help me get along with it. I'm rewarded every time I win with a prize. He uses the example of a child. And you're teaching a child to play, you might need to offer a small material reward, maybe some sweets or something. But in competitive practice, you might have a cash prize, some prestige. It's important not to mix the two up. That's MacIntyre's point here. You need both of them. It's not like practices are good, institutions are bad. You need both of them, but we have to be able to grasp when a practice, when some kind of activity that we're doing together as human beings ceases to be motivated by the good internal to that practice and becomes motivated by a good external to that practice. Let's use an education example just to wrap up the point here, right? Almost impossible nowadays, I think, to design a new institution that didn't offer some kind of accreditation, some kind of degree at the end. If we tried to do that and say learning is for its own sake, we just probably wouldn't get it off the ground, and we probably wouldn't be able to have it transmit itself over time. We're not doing things like offering salaries, hiring competent people, giving our students some kind of certificate that they can take on to future work, and hopefully then send their friends or children down the way back to the institution. But you can't mix up that acquisition of the certificate with the goods internal to education along the way. And when you do, you end up with a deeply warped, deeply confused understanding of what education is. That's, I think, one of the problems of elite institutions in this country, is they've become experts at getting the accreditation part down, giving you your particular certificate and having the right signals that they go on there. But they've done so by evacuating the whole content of what education is supposed to be about, and their anxiety over articulating that content has meant more and more they're just resting on this external good of the certificate that you get at the end, the accreditation, the social credit you get at the end of the degree to advance. And they can coast on that for a long time because it's certainly there. The degree from Princeton or Stanford or wherever will get you very far, but the students within have a sense that, look, I'm getting my degree, but is that it? Is this all just about the piece of paper and the job that I get afterwards with it, or do I want more?
Yeah, this section in After Virtue on the role of the manager remains well worth reading, right? The manager, with their incredible efficiency at solving problems, but not knowing what the purpose of the organization or institution is, except to have it continue. It's a beautiful, beautiful description.
Yeah, and this is precisely what Dr. Pinkoski's comments made me think about. In your discussion, you said that first of all, MacIntyre says that the bureaucratic nation state is illegitimate, which I think is independently a very interesting comment to make and a really sweeping statement, especially as we live in a bureaucratic nation state. But it also seems like he says that managerialism itself, which has actually been a theme of some of our webinars over the past half year, managerialism itself is kind of the natural result of this confusion over moral reasoning. So I'm curious if you can tease that out a little bit.
Well, yeah, so I think that what's important for us to bear in mind here is that managerialism rests on an assumption about our capacity to predict the behavior of rational agents down the road. And it therefore assumes that we can generate these laws of human behavior. And it's wrapped up with particular debates in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of social science about what we can say about human beings. But what it is resting a lot of its argument on is about a certain conception of human beings, a certain conception or indeed a diminishment of human freedom. And what that allows, what kind of range of activities that permits. What's attached to that, though, is a kind of claim about the legitimacy that is accrued to an expert class who acquires knowledge of that, of that law, of that predictive capacity. So this is the problem of managers. For MacIntyre, the problem of managers isn't that there's some all-powerful cabal working in, say, the World Economic Forum or something like that. You look closely at these people and you see that they're not actually that competent. They make a lot of silly mistakes and such. And MacIntyre would affirm that point. It's not that these are master puppet operators controlling the world. It's that they create this pretense that there are laws or there's activities that could allow you to do that, and that gap between what the reality is, these kind of incompetent, muddling people who can't even keep up with a slogan, to use the pandemic example, 2 weeks to stop the spread, right? Or the 5-year plan that RJ alluded to, that you're constantly reinventing what that means in the process of it to try to get to the goals that you can celebrate at the end of it, is just an indication that this is not the way human beings are. This rests on a philosophical mistake. And one of the key themes for MacIntyre that kind of goes across his work is if you start off with bad theory, you'll end up with bad practice. You'll end up with pernicious social and political consequences. And in that sense, that's where MacIntyre's where his primary role as a philosopher is important. Look for what the theoretical assumptions are informing these projects and examine them and see whether they hold up to scrutiny. And if they don't, you can expect there to be detrimental social consequences.
So I wanted to ask one more question before I get some of the audience questions. I think this, there's some groundwork that I'd like to lay. And Dr. Snell, you talk about how MacIntyre's master argument includes this third point, that in order to think about ethics properly, you need to think not just about how humans find themselves and then their sort of ethics or ethical obligations, but also how humans ought to be, their telos. And when thinking about ethics, I think that that's not necessarily something that would be hard to grasp for modern people, even though that certainly goes against the grain of a lot of modern liberal ethics. That absolutely does. It's kind of the opposite. But I do wonder how that kind of thinking ought to be applied to politics, because a lot of people in not just in a liberal society like our own, but in a pluralistic society would say that there are a lot of conceptions of what humans ought to be the human telos. And if that's the case, if we live in this liberal or at least pluralistic society where there's disagreement, and disagreement that might even be incommensurable, as MacIntyre himself says, how do you take this way of thinking about ethics, which MacIntyre seems to think is fundamental to how we ought to think about politics and reimagine politics? How do you take it and apply it to our political world?
Yeah, and excuse me, and even for MacIntyre, it changes. You know, and after virtue, he's not really a Thomist yet. He's an Aristotelian, and he explicitly rejects the idea of a biological telos, where by the time he gets to dependent rational animals, he's much more of a Thomist, and there's a sense that the body has a telos, and there's a metaphysical knowledge that one could have. And so by the time of dependent rational animals, it's thicker in some ways than it is even in after virtue. It's more, the charges of relativism are given against him in after virtue because it's almost too pluralistic in the eyes of some. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great problems of the time, isn't it? It seems to me that one can have a relatively robust account of the good, a thick, substantive account of the good, which realizes and recognizes that it's no weakness in the theory to know that the first principles of law are known with a high level of certainty and robustness, and the concrete application of those are known with much less thickness and much more prudential reserve. I've often thought that the people to be suspicious of in politics take one of two forms. One, those who are relativistic about principles but certain about what to do in the policy. And two, those who are, well, I guess those are the two. Those who are relativistic about the principles and those who are certain to do about what the policy is. It seems to me that you should be pretty certain about what the principles are and quite wary about what the policies are. And that the proper place of prudence and pluralism is about the policies. I can have a quite robust sense of what the human good is, or what sorts of things are thwarting of the human good or detrimental to the human good, while acknowledging that at least one aspect of the human good is the freedom of at least some self-determination. Take the good of religion. I think there are religious truths which can be known with a high level of certainty from reason alone. And yet I also am convinced that the good of religion requires non-coercion and requires that individuals determine and understand the truth as best they are able to themselves and live in keeping with the harmony of, to live in harmony with those truths as they understand them to be. And I see there be no real tension there. That's the Republican experiment. Some pretty robust account of what the good life is, and a whole lot of tolerance and pluralism as individuals live that out for themselves. That sounds utterly vacuous, but that's the political problem as I understand it. And in the devil's in the details always.
And Dr. Pinkoski, do you have any thoughts about this I guess, tension?
I do have a few. I think that the most important look, the most important thing I think to bear in mind is to have that hesitation to apply too readily from moving from the first principles to the particular aspects of it. Any good understanding of natural law, and once MacIntyre is a full-fledged Thomist, I think he realizes this, has to recognize that the scope for the second pertains to the virtue of prudence, and therefore requires an assessment of what the particular circumstances are. The particular, though, MacIntyrean gloss we can give on some of this, and this is part of the more politically provocative side of MacIntyre, is the way he understands the common good is about a shared understanding of the good that entails a small-scale society. And this is one of the requirements he builds into to the definition of what a common good is, because he places so much stress on what the common good is as a community of what he says a community of political learning and participation in rational inquiry. So these exercises and these societies can only ever be a small scale, and that entails the hard consequence to draw out of it. That entails looking at these massive nation-state projects or these massive federal republics, whether it's the United States or Canada, or probably even a federal republic like Germany or Belgium, and saying that these projects are just too large to achieve a meaningful account of the common good, because we can't get to that high level of deliberation, that high level of discussion that would entail. And because we can't get there, we are in the dangerous position whereby there are those who presume to speak for millions of people who are given a great deal of coercive power that then they run in directions which are not conducive towards the common good. So we have to have a rejection of bigness in order to begin the pursuit of the common good. If we're too wrapped up and fetishize that kind of political form MacIntyre thinks, we're not going to actually get an account of the common good. We're going to get something that pretends to be the common good, and that will bring coercion, oppression, despotism, and so forth.
Can I just piggyback off that? I think that's important when we think about the university too. So I think maybe I'm misquoting this, or I'm inventing a phrase that MacIntyre may never have used, but I remember MacIntyre somewhere saying one of the purposes of the university is an ongoing argument about the purpose of the university. And I think that's why it matters in pluralism that we maintain the difference between the universities. So if there's going to be a Stanford, it's important that there's a Haverford. And if there's a Haverford, it's important that there's a Wyoming Catholic. But they really oughtn't be identical to each other. And it's really important that the good people of Wyoming Catholic don't try to emulate Haverford or Stanford too much, and that they have their own particular account of the role of the university. And a sane pluralism defends the reality and existence of Wyoming Catholic and does not attempt to subsume it into another vision.
So that point brings up something that I was very interested in from Dr. Pinkoski's talk. So I'll allow myself one more question before I get into audience questions. But Dr. Pinkoski, you talk about the benefits of depth in a way that I think is compelling, but it also runs against an argument that is, or it sounds at least like it could be in tension with an argument that's very popular amongst people who are sympathetic to the type of project that you might see at the National Association of Scholars or other places where you see a robust defense of things like academic freedom and intellectual inquiry. So right now, the critique of the university is that we have institutions that are imposing things like equity statements, where people have to come and in order to qualify for a certain job, they have to, some people would argue, really declare their allegiance to a particular view of the world. And one argument might just be that that's bad because everyone's doing it. But another argument might be that it's bad in general to require people to, as a condition for their employment at a university to signal their allegiance to a particular doctrine, because that impedes their ability to freely explore ideas, which is at least some people's vision of how the university ought to operate. So how do you how would you suggest that the framework you've set up can interact with that contemporary argument about intellectual freedom at modern universities?
Yeah, and well, look, I think that MacIntyre is actually on side with a lot of those projects. I mean, one thing he does stress, this actually pertains to one of the comments that came up in the chat about MacIntyre's response to, say, oppressive societies and people trying to get out of those societies and go elsewhere, is that MacIntyre is against coercion. Against almost any form of coercion. This is, in fact, so strong that he's very close to someone like Stanley Harras, right, who has this view of Christian anarchy, opposition to institutions that exercise coercive power and embrace of pacifism. I don't think MacIntyre goes that far. I can't think of any statement where he affirms something like that. Indeed, the contrary, he praises what happened in the Second World War at one place, thinks that was a necessary kind of alliance of the great democracies, right, against against tyranny. But he's against coercion. And that means that he also says that any account of the common good, because it's based on this kind of communicative ideal, this ideal of deliberation, has to have space for radically dissenting views within it. So I think that what he sees happening in the modern university is precisely this exercise of coercion done under the liberal name, or the coercive, or sorry, the progressive name, and lo and behold, it's this effort to try to use the language of either neutrality or everyone can agree to be anti-racist, right? Who's for racism, right? This is very broad language that is set up in a polemical way, and I think he'd say two things to that. One is he'd say, like, look, this is what I tell you goes along in the liberal project. This part is part of the theoretical error of liberalism and the way it takes us. But he'd also say, I think, simply that this is unjust. It's unjust to ask for people as a requirement of membership in organizations which are seemingly dedicated to rational inquiry, to affirm these statements that close rational inquiry down. Now, it might be that he'd be more sympathetic to an organization that actually did this, developed its own internal standards and got agreement about such that it presented itself and was able to give certain statements that were like that. I think there's an openness in MacIntyre to something like that. However, this is where MacIntyre, the ethicist, I think, comes in a strong manner, right? He does have a commitment to absolute moral prohibitions that is not going to be surrendered or cast away, and communities that violate those prohibitions are not conducive to human flourishing. So even if we were able to articulate, say, this kind of DEI statement or this anti-racist statement in such a way that it wasn't engaged in coercion, wasn't engaged in setting up new racial hierarchies, wasn't engaged in unjust descriptions of the past and attributing guilt to particular races where one cannot do that. Even if we develop that kind of perfect statement, we would still be scrutinizing it for its adherence to uphold to that standard. So I think he might say to our discussions about academic freedom, yes, affirm that principle, but also don't be afraid to make the moral criticism for institutions that are going off the rails. Don't just rest it on a kind of, it goes to what RJ said, don't just rest it on libertarian argument. Individuals can think whatever they want, do whatever they want inside the setting of the university, that kind of discussion of academic freedom. Make sure you tie it to an understanding of the human good.
And since you brought up that first audience question, I do want to go to this point because I think a lot of people who identify as conservatives can certainly find sympathy for stories about about coming from countries that are oppressive or that have some kind of social order that actually have very robust social roles. And because of that, they see the kind of liberty that MacIntyre actually criticizes as having a lot of virtues based on their past experience. So how would MacIntyre address somebody who sees the great virtue in say the American project?
Yeah, I think RJ and I are both in agreement on this because we fled the refuges of the great white tyranny of the North. We're both Canadians in exile, so we understand entirely what is going on in these kinds of things. But look, I think this is MacIntyre, the leftist, where leftists often have a sensitivity to oppression, does play an important role here. He's not going to endorse he's not going to endorse coercive orders, as I already said. He's not going to endorse orders that are not conducive to human flourishing, and he's going to have a certain respect or deference towards those who try to flee those, even if upon closer analysis it might look like that the actual oppression wasn't real or was based on was based on a false understanding of what was going on, or was attached to an ideal of freedom that was a libertarian ideal, which is ultimately incoherent. But I think what he would do is he would press people who come out of that to think about, when they're articulating their ideal of freedom or when they're in pursuit of it, what are the kind of dependent relationships that they're in that require them to achieve that ideals? In which way do they depend upon others, and which way are others dependent upon them to achieve that particular goal of freedom? And I think he would encourage those who define themselves by pursuit of that ideal to think about the social contexts that require the attainment of that ideal. And what I think that would help people realize who are making freedom the primary good like that is, in fact, they're talking about other goods as well that are a requirement of human flourishing. It's not just about freedom. There are other things that are a requirement and come into the picture there that are required to have the flourishing community, which probably wasn't found in the old world, in the old country from which one fled.
Yeah, it seems to me important to remember that for MacIntyre, the fact that we're socially embedded and have social roles, and the fact that reason is going to be tradition constituted, is not the same thing as suggesting that all social roles, merely because they are found in the tradition, are to be defended or to be good. I mean, he's quite dismissive of what I take to be an unfair read of Burke, but his read of Burke, he's quite dismissive of tradition for tradition's sake. And the chapter in After Virtue on heroic societies, where the chieftain's son knows who he is and what to do, and the chieftain's daughter also knows who she is and what to do, that's not viewed by MacIntyre as the good. So we are socially embedded, and reason is tradition constituted, but it's not as if tradition is a good per se. He goes out of his way to suggest that we can mark the differences of how rational a tradition actually is by its ability to critique itself, its ability to hear criticisms from outside of the tradition and to accurately translate into its own patois or its own language the critiques from external traditions, to subsume them, absorb them, moderate itself when it needs to, and to survive as an ongoing tradition. So if something is immune to criticism, that's probably a mark that it's an irrational tradition. So he's quite open to the fact that traditions need to develop, that traditions can in fact be irrational and oppressive.
Another audience question is directed to you, Dr. Snell, asking you to elaborate how MacIntyre might be accused of relativism. I've heard people suggest this before. The audience member says that Robert George has raised this as a concern. So I'm curious what you think, where you think that concern comes from, and then I guess how do you respond to that accusation?
Yeah, so as I understand it, that charge is generally raised if you read After Virtue in sort of a vacuum. So After Virtue begins with a sense of problem or aporia, which is you can look at various traditions and discover that if you accept the first premises of those traditions, then you have all of these things which follow in perfect logical validity from those first premises. So you can start with the Lockean tradition, start with its assumptions, and arrive in perfect validity at a certain set of assumptions. Same with Marx, same with Thomas. But it doesn't appear as if there's any way to adjudicate between or among those first premises. They just seem to be there. And at least on one reading of After Virtue, or an objection to After Virtue, is that MacIntyre doesn't, in fact, robustly solve the problem which he appears to raise at the beginning of the book, which is we have different traditions, they have their premises, you can arrive at valid conclusions from them, but there doesn't seem to be any principle of commensuration between or among those traditions, let alone how you solve them, or how you choose between them. If you add on to that a robust sense, maybe even more robust than MacIntyre means, of tradition-constituted rationality, that sounds an awful lot like reason just is the outworking of the commitments of the tradition. and the tradition overdetermines the commitments of rationality. So that's been a charge that's been raised against MacIntyre in one way or the other. He himself certainly does not accept that. He's not a relativist. He's not cheering for relativism. It could be viewed as a weakness of after virtue, just insofar as in after virtue, which MacIntyre later repudiates, that he is unwilling to accept in after virtue a thick account of metaphysics or a thicker account of theoretical anthropology, which his later work, as he becomes more and more Thomistic, he's much more willing to embrace. So yeah, it's a fair objection, fair-ish objection to certain aspects of after virtue. It's not where the MacIntyrean project ends up, as I understand it, even though he's certainly aware that we are unable, given the way that reason, or he's not especially open to the idea that reason works in a sort of Kantian way where we just fly into the ether of pure rationality and pure morality and look like gods down upon the universe. We're going to begin kind of always in the middle of conversations, always in the middle of arguments, but certainly he's not a relativist, as one read of after virtue might suggest.
I want to talk about the idea of embeddedness and social roles a little bit more before, as a preface to one of the audience questions. Really, I'm curious what both of you would say about just the project of rebuilding a kind of embeddedness, a kind of sense of a renewed sense of social role, which seems to be an important precondition to getting back to what MacIntyre sees as a proper morality. After we've had this sort of dissolution, after we've had institutions of all types that treat us and make us think of ourselves as totally disembedded people. So what I guess, one way you can phrase this question is, what is MacIntyre's solution in practical terms?
Yeah, I think for you, Nathan. The question to press him on, because he does allude to this aspect about the importance of creating new practices. He does look particularly towards local initiatives like school initiatives as salutary to be building up this new way of thinking. But it's important to bear in mind that while he's doing that, he also has that critical element, right? This constructive element is so wrapped up with the critical element too, that what he giveth with one hand, he taketh away with the other, right? In the sense that if we get too excited about some of these projects and too excited about some of the institutions that we're creating, it's possible that under his analysis, we might be too complicit in the kind of broader, wide-scale modern institutions that he is keen to criticize. Just to speak to one line in the question, this is why he doesn't affirm something like a Benedict option. The Benedict option is not radical enough in a way. It requires us to have this kind of move in and forth between all these different levels of institutions. That's what Dreyer's argument is about. It's not a withdrawal. It's kind of, let's reinvigorate this here. Let's reinvigorate this here. Let's pull out of this one here. Let's get back into this one up here, but let's build up over here, right? That's what's going on in his kind of argument. It's kind of like localism, a renewed emphasis on localism, or renewed emphasis on institutions, as many conservatives have spoken about. That's the tradition he comes from. MacIntyre does not come from that tradition, right? I think, just to reiterate something I said at the start, he does think most of the institutions in which we inhabit, most of the modern institutions, are not just obstacles to human flourishing, but are actually taking us away from human flourishing, are actually promoting false conceptions of it. So we're going to have to be able to move away from a lot of these. And this is, I think, a tension between MacIntyre, the one who wants to build new practices, and one who recognizes that the conflict, to cite the title of his last book, the conflicts of modernity actually run in a way through the human heart. we're pulled into compartmentalization as not just a way of our whole political order, dividing things off into different categories here, church there, state there, however it might be, but this is something that actually affects our very way of life, our very being. So we can make studies of modern moral actors. This is how the book ends, as in the conflict of modernity. We can make study of modern actors and see how they were pulled in various ways. They have these internal contradictions running through them because of the various roles, the various activities that they tried to take up. So that kind of problem is not one that's going to be solved by going out and getting involved in your local school board, going out involved in educational reform or something like that, much as that is important. That's really a spiritual problem. That points to this problem of the transformation in philosophical anthropology that we've alluded to as one of the themes underlying after virtue. And that's much more difficult to change, much more personal, much more intimate.
I might see it just slightly differently, not on the large, but on the small. And I can hear some of my friends rolling their eyes. I can hear them rolling their eyes. Yeah, I can almost hear them. That's how much they're rolling their eyes at this sort of comment, which is, I think it's funny that MacIntyre and so many people of his ilk, nonetheless, we end up in the United States because this is where it's possible. It's just possible here still, despite its many failures. I still do. I know my friends think I'm naive. I take an enormous amount of solace that Tocqueville's description of the United States has not fundamentally changed, and that we still are a place relatively compared to other places in which there is association and the commitment to association. So I actually do think the joining of the school board or the starting of a charter school or the starting of a homeschool co-op is the place where the conflict that runs through the human heart is the kind of concrete field of battle, not only where the politics get shaped, but where the human being gets shaped. Because so many of the institutions have taught us to be unencumbered and not involved. We have to retrain ourselves in the narratives and the practices which lead to the virtues of things like commitments and giving and receiving and justice and courage and so on. And I think that that's, for most of us, where that happens is we create a small local association and we learn in that field. That's where we learn tolerance. That's where we learn justice. That's where we learn self-sacrifice, which certainly doesn't fundamentally change, I'm using Augustine here, the concupiscence of the human heart, but it's a place where the concupiscence of the human heart gets smacked by reality a little bit and becomes more moderate.
So RJ, are you saying that MacIntyre is a little too harsh towards the Benedict option?
I don't know even what the Benedict option is anymore. I don't think anybody knows what the Benedict option is anymore. And, in the early blog post, it was head for the hills, run away. By the end of the book, it was not something. And I think Rod properly decries everyone's interpretation of what the Benedict option is. And he says, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I don't know what it is anymore, though. I think if the Benedict option is, we have to pay attention to local institutions and the local commitments we have. Yeah, sign me up. Because I do think the associations are where our personality will learn to flourish and mature. Because associations with real people is really hard. You can't just sign off or block someone in your local community in the same way that you can online. You got to deal with that guy, or he's got to deal with you. You might be the troublemaker, it turns out.
Okay, well, we're almost at a place where I'd like to ask both of you for maybe 2-minute closing remarks. But before we do that, I'd like to just say thank you to everyone once again. Thank you to Nathan and RJ. Thank you to the audience members and those of you who are listening after we've recorded this. This webinar project is something that the National Association of Scholars wants to continue to do, to contribute to intellectual inquiry in ways that we think that you don't necessarily always get from the university system that we so frequently criticize. So that said, we do have more webinars in this series coming up. We have one webinar next week on Philip Reef, another on Michael Oakeshott, and then right before Christmas, we have a webinar that I'm very excited about on Wendell Berry. So all of these are figures you don't always hear about in kind of discussions of conservative influences, and I think it'll be very exciting to talk about all of those people. So please consider logging in next time and continue to bring your questions and come ready to learn. I didn't get to all of the questions in the chat. If you have questions, if you submitted a question in the chat and would like to have the panelists answer them, or if you have your own questions now that we've gone through this full almost hour and a half, feel free to email me. My email address is Sailer, S-A-I-L-E-R, @nas.org, and I'd be happy to pass along the questions to our panelists. So that said, Nathan and RJ, I would love to get just maybe a closing thought from each of you. And RJ, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah, sure. You know, MacIntyre can be infuriating to read. He likes to take he likes to challenge and prick many of the things which seem self-evident and intuitive to people. He's a real philosopher in that sense. He's a gadfly and an irritant. And while he certainly has his own constructive project that he's engaging in, a whole lot of what he's trying to do is to sweep away impediments and to call into question what many have taken to be self-evident. I know in my own intellectual biography, there's been times I've been closer to MacIntyre and times I've been farther away from him. But he's the sort of thinker who's worth revisiting. And when you find yourself disagreeing with him, asking yourself whether you're in the right or not, because you know, he's one of the greatest living philosophers that we have. And we are well served to view him the way we would view a kind of Socrates, which is a gadfly from whom there's something to learn merely by how he challenges us. And when we can't answer him well, that's something to pay attention to, or I've found it so.
Yeah, that's an excellent picture to bear in mind. And all that I could add to that, it goes a little bit to our little discussion about school boards and homeschooling co-ops, is there is, in the way that MacIntyre is as a philosopher and not someone who's involved in politics, and not someone who's involved in action. And he had a little bit of that early on in his career, where he was involved in a lot of more activist things, and then more or less since he moved to the US, he stepped away from a lot of that. There's always the danger of taking someone who writes philosophically, who's looking, say, in the position of someone who's reflecting on one's times, trying to understand in one's times, wherein you look at that and you think that we, like the owl of Minerva flying at dusk, right? Yes, let me put it like this. We think of ourselves in that position and we presuppose a narrative of decline on our object. And there's a bit of that in MacIntyre, but that's not the whole story. The whole story isn't just the pessimism that we often attribute to him, his hesitation to articulate constructive solutions. The reason he has that hesitation is because he's committed to that philosophical understanding of the world. And for those of us who are, I think, reading MacIntyre and trying to think, well, what can we do going forward? Is it just that we're caught in this position of commenting on the world in decline, the world that is in dusk, our civilization that's in dusk? I don't think that's the case. I think we have to bear in mind that you can be MacIntyrean and see what he's doing as an invitation to join an ongoing intellectual project. That's why you can't just read After Virtue as a single book, because he conceives of it as this ongoing work, this work that invites a further criticism and revision. And what I think that allows us to do is to be open to thinking about genuine practical solutions, new things to build that can help us get out of the the stagnation, the blockage, the sheer ruin of aspects of our civilization. But it will be a multi-generational project. We may not see the fruits of it in our lifetime. What we can do is we can focus on that task of transmission, and we can think about participating in the institutions, associations, societies that are engaged in that. And that might help us resolve this spiritual crisis that we face as moderns that I alluded to, this problem of compartmentalized and fragmented selves, not just society. This could be the way of healing. And what we need in a way to keep the MacIntyrean insights going is look for examples of people who are doing that well, places or societies that are doing that well, and study them, ask what we can learn from them, and perhaps imitate them.
Dr. Snell and Dr. Pinkoski, thank you so much for participating in this webinar today. Thank you to our audience members. This has been a great conversation, and I hope that, like myself, everyone is inspired now to go read more MacIntyre.
Thanks so much.